For decades, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses has been known for its strict hierarchy and absolute control. But between 2005 and 2023, something changed. A new tone emerged, sharper, colder, and more authoritarian than ever before. And at the center of it stood one man, Anthony Morris. To many inside the organization, he was the voice of loyalty and purity. To others, he became the face of fear, the man who turned obedience into a weapon and made unquestioning submission the highest form of faith. This is not a story about one leader among many. It's the story of how one personality, shaped by military discipline and religious zeal, helped transform a global organization into its most rigid and fearful state in modern history. Because when Anthony Morris rose to power, the Watchtower stopped merely asking for obedience, it began to demand it. Understanding this transformation requires looking beyond the official narrative. It means examining not just what was said from the platforms, but what was felt in the pews. It means listening to the voices of those who lived through it, the ones who stayed silent out of fear, the ones who left broken, and the ones who remained trapped between belief and doubt. The story of Anthony Morris is not simply about religious leadership. It's about power, psychology, and the mechanisms of control that can turn faith into fear. It's about how a single voice, amplified by institutional authority, can reshape the spiritual landscape for millions. And most importantly, it's about recognizing the human cost of authoritarian religion, the families divided, the minds controlled, and the lives lived under constant spiritual surveillance. What makes this era so significant is not just its severity, but its success. The Watchtower under Morris's influence didn't just maintain control through explicit rules, it mastered the art of making followers police themselves. It created a system where doubt was sin, questions were apostasy, and loyalty to human leaders became indistinguishable from faith in God. The rise of a loyal soldier. Anthony Morris wasn't born into power. He earned it through a life built on discipline, loyalty, and command. Before stepping onto the stage of the Watchtower, Morris served in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. Those years marked him deeply. He often referenced them in his talks, describing the importance of following orders and staying in line. What sounded like harmless analogies to most witnesses were, in truth, reflections of his worldview. Authority is sacred, questioning it is betrayal. The military experience shaped more than just his rhetoric. It formed the very foundation of his leadership philosophy. In the structured world of military hierarchy, orders flow downward without debate. Soldiers don't question their commanders. They execute. Success is measured not by independent thinking, but by precision in following directives. This mindset, forged in the crucible of war, became the template Morris would later apply to spiritual leadership. When he entered the ranks of Jehovah's Witnesses leadership, he brought that soldier's mindset with him, and it would change everything. His path to the governing body wasn't accidental. Morris demonstrated the exact qualities the organization valued most: unwavering loyalty, strict adherence to organizational procedure, and an ability to enforce discipline without compromise. He worked his way through various positions of responsibility, always showing himself to be a man who valued order above all else. By the time Morris was appointed to the governing body in 2005, the organization was already known for its control. But under his influence, that control took on a new, almost militarized tone. His public addresses were filled with emotional pressure and moral intimidation. He spoke with conviction, but his words often carried an undertone of threat, implying that any deviation from the rules was not just disobedience, but spiritual treason. Unlike some of his fellow governing body members who maintained a softer, more pastoral approach, Morris spoke with the directness of a commanding officer. He didn't suggest or recommend. He commanded. His delivery was deliberate, his pauses calculated, his voice carrying an intensity that made listeners lean forward. Whether addressing thousands at international conventions or speaking through broadcast videos, Morris had a presence that demanded attention. Followers began to fear not just being wrong, but being watched. His style resonated with the governing body's desire for uniformity, making him one of the most visible and commanding figures of that era. He became particularly known for his willingness to address controversial topics that other leaders avoided. He didn't shy away from making pronouncements about dress codes, entertainment choices, education, career decisions, and personal grooming. Every aspect of a witness's life, in Morris's view, fell under the jurisdiction of organizational authority. His talks often featured vivid illustrations drawn from his military past. He would describe the consequences of soldiers who didn't follow orders, drawing parallels to witnesses who didn't follow the governing body's direction. These weren't subtle metaphors, they were explicit warnings. Just as a soldier's disobedience could endanger an entire unit, a witness's independent thinking could spiritually contaminate an entire congregation. Behind closed doors, former insiders describe Morris as fiercely loyal to the hierarchy, but ruthless toward dissent. He had little patience for nuance or empathy, preferring sharp boundaries over dialogue. In committee meetings, he reportedly advocated for stricter policies and harsher disciplinary measures. When cases of apostasy were discussed, Morris pushed for swift action and clear consequences. To him, mercy could be mistaken for weakness, and weakness could undermine the entire structure. Under his watch, elders and circuit overseers were reminded constantly that obedience was the measure of faithfulness. Training programs for congregation leaders took on a more rigid tone. Elders were taught to spot warning signs of independent thinking, questions about prophecies, research into organizational history, sympathy for disfellowshipped individuals, or even excessive education. These were treated not as innocent curiosities, but as potential threats requiring immediate attention. It wasn't enough to believe in Jehovah, one had to believe in the organization, and in those who ruled it. Morris made this point repeatedly, often without diplomatic softening. In one particularly memorable broadcast, he stated plainly that trusting the governing body was equivalent to trusting God, because God worked exclusively through the organization. This equation, God equals organization equals governing body, became a cornerstone of his teaching. In this environment, Anthony Morris thrived. He wasn't merely a leader in the Watchtower. He became its enforcer. While other governing body members played the role of spiritual fathers or teachers, Morris embodied discipline and judgment. He was the one willing to say what others only implied, to draw lines where others preferred gray areas, to make enemies in service of what he believed was organizational purity. His influence extended beyond his own talks. Other speakers began adopting his tone, his phrases, his uncompromising approach. Circuit overseers referenced his speeches in their visits to congregations. Elders quoted him in judicial committees. His worldview permeated the organization's culture, creating a shift that many longtime witnesses noticed but few dared to name. As Anthony Morris's influence grew, so did the Watchtower's obsession with obedience. Under his tenure, the organization intensified its war against what it called spiritual independence. From the platforms of conventions to the pages of the Watchtower, the message was clear: thinking for yourself was dangerous. Morris frequently warned against listening to apostates, reading independent material, or even spending time online without direction. His tone was not merely pastoral. It was militant. In his eyes, the greatest threat wasn't persecution from the outside, but doubt from within. And that idea became the foundation of a new age of fear. The concept of spiritual independence itself deserves examination. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, a warning against pride or self-reliance disconnected from God. But in practice, it became a weapon against critical thinking. Any attempt to verify organizational claims through independent research was labeled as spiritual independence. Reading the Bible without Watchtower publications as a guide was spiritual independence. Forming personal conclusions about doctrine was spiritual independence. The term was deliberately vague, allowing it to be applied to virtually any behavior that threatened institutional control. It was during these years that the concept of apostasy was stretched to new extremes. Questioning organizational policies, expressing sympathy for those who left, or even asking too many questions could be labeled as rebellion. The definition expanded from those who actively opposed the organization to include anyone who simply didn't show sufficient enthusiasm for its directives. Former elders described the pressure they faced during this period. They were given lists of warning signs to watch for in their congregations. A member who missed meetings might be struggling spiritually, or might be falling away. Someone who asked about failed prophecies might be genuinely curious, or might be infected with apostate thinking. The elders were trained to assume the worst, to treat doubt as disease, to intervene before questions could spread. Local elders were encouraged to monitor the flock closely, while family members were reminded that loyalty to Jehovah meant loyalty to the governing body, even if it meant cutting ties with their own blood. The shunning policy, already harsh, became even more strictly enforced. Parents were instructed to cut off all contact with disfellowshipped children, even adult children with families of their own. Grandparents were told they couldn't see their grandchildren if the parents had been expelled from the organization. Morris himself spoke frequently about disfellowshipping, always framing it as an act of love, a way to motivate the expelled person to return. But the real function was clear. It served as the ultimate deterrent. The threat of losing one's entire social network, one's family, one's identity, kept millions in line even when their conscience screamed otherwise. The fear of being disfellowshipped became a silent weapon, ensuring that few dared to challenge anything said from the stage. People learned to censor their own thoughts before speaking them aloud. Conversations with fellow witnesses became exercises in careful wording, where even close friends might hesitate to share genuine doubts. The surveillance wasn't just external, it became internal, with believers monitoring their own minds for dangerous thoughts. The organization no longer relied on reason or persuasion, it relied on control through fear. Study articles stopped presenting evidence for doctrines and instead simply asserted them. When the generation teaching changed multiple times, causing confusion among long-time witnesses, the response wasn't to provide better explanations, it was to warn against questioning Jehovah's organization. When predictions about 1975 and the year 2000 failed to materialize, the approach wasn't to acknowledge error, it was to suggest that those who remembered these predictions were listening to apostates. What made this period particularly dark was how effectively Morris masked control as devotion. He often framed submission as a privilege and equated loyalty with love. In his rhetoric, the harshest requirements became gifts from a loving God. Shunning wasn't cruelty, it was discipline in love. Prohibitions on higher education weren't limitations, they were protection from worldly thinking. The elimination of personal choice wasn't oppression, it was unity in God's organization. Under his leadership, countless witnesses learned to suppress their doubts, to silence their questions, to see obedience as an act of worship. Young people learned not to pursue their dreams but to subordinate them to organizational goals. Adults learned to consult elders before making major life decisions. Families learned to prioritize meeting attendance over personal health or family time. The message was consistent: your life is not your own. To resist was to betray God himself. This equation, that resisting organizational authority meant resisting God, created an impossible psychological trap. How could a sincere believer who loved God justify disagreement with those who claimed to speak for him? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, leaving many witnesses in a state of perpetual anxiety, always questioning whether they were doing enough, believing enough, submitting enough. In that psychological climate, the line between faith and fear vanished, and the Watchtower became not just a religion, but a system of absolute conformity. Meetings followed identical formats worldwide. Answers to study questions were expected to match the paragraph exactly. Personal testimonies were discouraged unless they emphasized organizational loyalty. Even prayers became formulaic, using approved phrases and avoiding topics that might suggest independent thought. The homogenization was deliberate. Diversity of thought, even on minor matters, was treated as a weakness. Morris and those who shared his worldview believed that unity meant uniformity, that strength came from everyone thinking, speaking, and acting identically. The global brotherhood they envisioned wasn't a diverse family united by love, it was an army united by command. During Anthony Morris's years on the governing body, the Watchtower underwent one of the most significant structural transformations in its modern history. The shift from Brooklyn to Warwick wasn't just a change of location, it was a consolidation of power. Under the guise of efficiency and unity, decision-making was stripped from local branches and concentrated in a single, tightly controlled headquarters. Regional offices were closed, Bethels around the world were downsized, and hundreds of workers were reassigned or dismissed. For many, it felt less like a spiritual adjustment and more like a corporate takeover. The human cost of this reorganization was substantial. Bethel workers who had dedicated decades of their lives to full-time service suddenly found themselves reassigned to the field. These weren't young volunteers with backup plans. Many were middle-aged or elderly individuals who had given up careers, education, and family planning to serve at headquarters. They left with minimal financial support and had to rebuild lives in a world they hadn't been part of for years. The official narrative emphasized trust and faith. Witnesses were told that Jehovah was directing these changes, that downsizing reflected a shift in priorities toward digital evangelism. But those affected described a different reality: cold efficiency, corporate-style terminations, and a stunning lack of pastoral care from an organization that claimed to be a spiritual family. And behind the curtain of these administrative moves stood the unmistakable tone of men like Morris, firm, uncompromising, and loyal to order above all. His influence in these decisions may have been behind the scenes, but the philosophy was pure Morris. Institutional needs outweigh individual concerns. Loyalty means accepting decisions without question, and questioning leadership reveals spiritual weakness. The financial structures of the organization also changed dramatically. Congregations that once managed their own funds were now required to send them directly to the global headquarters, where the governing body could redistribute resources as needed. The move was justified as an act of stewardship and trust in Jehovah's direction, but to insiders, it signaled the end of local autonomy. Before these changes, individual congregations operated with relative financial independence. Local elders managed their budgets, decided on repairs and improvements, and maintained control over their kingdom halls. This arrangement, while not perfect, gave congregations a sense of ownership and responsibility. The new system eliminated that entirely. Elders no longer had discretion over congregation spending or property ownership. Everything, from kingdom hall maintenance to construction projects, now required approval from Warwick. Congregations were told to send monthly donations based on a formula calculated by headquarters. Even if a local congregation had no immediate needs and wanted to save for future repairs, they were expected to send funds upward. More troubling was what happened to kingdom hall properties. In many cases, congregations that had spent years fundraising, building, and maintaining their own halls suddenly found those properties transferred to the organization's ownership. Halls that local members had built with their own hands, that represented decades of sacrifice and community effort, were now corporate assets that could be sold without local input. And sell them they did. In markets where property values had increased, the organization began selling kingdom halls and consolidating congregations. The official explanation focused on efficiency, but the financial motivation was transparent. Congregations that once worshipped in their own dedicated buildings found themselves sharing facilities or meeting in rented spaces, while the proceeds from their former kingdom hall disappeared into organizational coffers. For the first time, the governing body didn't just lead the religion spiritually, it controlled it economically. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. By controlling the finances, the leadership ensured that no regional branch, no national organization, no local congregation could operate independently or resist central directives. Economic dependence created structural submission. The cultural impact was immediate. Witnesses who had spent decades feeling part of a spiritual family began to sense they were serving an institution. The personal relationships, the local community bonds, the sense of ownership over their place of worship, all of this eroded as power centralized. The new policies discouraged personal initiative and promoted silence. Elders who had once been trusted to make local decisions found themselves implementing directives from above without explanation. When congregation members asked why their kingdom hall was being sold, elders often didn't know. They had simply been told it was organizational direction, and were expected to support the decision without question. Those who questioned the changes were told they lacked humility or faith. The response to criticism followed a predictable pattern. First, dismissal of concerns as unimportant details. Second, reminders that the governing body had access to information regular witnesses didn't. Third, implications that persistent questioning revealed spiritual weakness or even apostasy. Yet the paradox was clear. While the organization preached simplicity and sacrifice, the leadership oversaw an empire of real estate, media, and financial assets. The new Warwick headquarters was a modern compound worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The organization owned properties worldwide worth billions. It produced professional-quality video content using state-of-the-art facilities. The contrast between the message of sacrifice and the reality of wealth became increasingly difficult to ignore. Under Anthony Morris's influence, the Watchtower perfected a new model, one that merged faith with management, obedience with corporate control, and devotion with dependence. The organization that once presented itself as separate from worldly corporate structures began operating with the efficiency and ruthlessness of any major corporation. The irony wasn't lost on long-time witnesses. They had been taught for decades that Babylon the Great, false religion, was corrupt partly because of its wealth and institutional power. Yet their own organization was accumulating both at an unprecedented rate. When they raised these concerns, they were reminded that God's organization needed resources to do God's work, a justification that sounded increasingly hollow as kingdom halls closed and resources flowed upward. Anthony Morris's greatest legacy wasn't in policy or property, it was in psychology. He mastered the art of shaping minds through emotional manipulation disguised as spiritual zeal. His talks became infamous for their intensity. Sharp warnings about Satan's influence, vivid imagery of destruction, and endless reminders that the end was near. He often used guilt as a motivator, warning that those who hesitated in their service or questioned the organization's direction risked displeasing Jehovah. One of his most notorious talks involved detailed criticism of clothing choices, particularly tight pants, which he claimed were part of a homosexual agenda infiltrating the organization. To outsiders, this seemed bizarre and homophobic. To witnesses accustomed to organizational control over personal choices, it was just another area where their autonomy was being stripped away. But the real message wasn't about pants, it was about power. If the leadership could dictate something as personal as clothing style, what couldn't they control? Morris also became known for his apocalyptic rhetoric. He frequently suggested the end was imminent, that current events were clear signs of the last days, that witnesses needed to be ready at any moment. This constant state of urgency served multiple purposes. It discouraged long-term planning, justified sacrifices in education and career, and created dependency on the organization as the only source of salvation. His famous hot dog illustration, where he suggested witnesses should avoid stores that sold birthday cakes because they didn't want to support birthday celebrations, exemplified his extremism. The logic was absurd. By that reasoning, witnesses couldn't shop almost anywhere. But the absurdity was the point. Morris was testing how far he could push obedience, how much control followers would accept. Over time, members internalized his tone. They no longer needed external pressure. Fear had been planted inside their conscience. Parents began policing their own children more strictly, not because they wanted to, but because they feared being seen as spiritually weak. Teenagers learned to hide their questions and doubts, knowing that expressing them might lead to restrictions or, worse, judicial committees. This internal conditioning reached families, marriages, and friendships. Parents taught their children that the highest virtue was loyalty to the organization, not to truth or love. Stories circulated of parents turning in their own children for apostasy, of spouses reporting each other for doubt, of friends betraying friends to elders. The organization had successfully turned natural human bonds into instruments of control. Husbands and wives monitored each other's spirituality, afraid that one person's doubt could endanger both. Marriages became spiritual partnerships where genuine intimacy gave way to mutual surveillance. Couples learned to avoid certain topics, to keep doubts hidden even from their closest companion. The trust that should have been the foundation of marriage became another casualty of organizational control. The community became self-policing, a network of sincere believers unknowingly serving as enforcers of obedience. Congregation members watched each other's social media, reported entertainment choices that seemed inappropriate, noted who answered at meetings and who stayed silent. Elders received constant reports from well-meaning witnesses who believed they were protecting the congregation but were actually feeding a culture of suspicion. And whenever guilt or exhaustion surfaced, Morris's speeches about enduring until the end reminded them that pain was proof of faithfulness. Feeling burned out from the demanding schedule of meetings, service, and study? That's Satan trying to make you slow down. Feeling conflicted about shunning your disfellowshipped sister? That's your imperfect heart fighting against Jehovah's righteous standards. Feeling doubt about prophecies that haven't come true? That's the beginning of apostasy. He had built something more effective than any rulebook, a culture where submission was synonymous with salvation. Witnesses didn't follow rules just because they were rules. They followed them because their entire identity, their eternal future, and their understanding of love for God had been fused with organizational obedience. To outsiders, Morris's words might have seemed dramatic or outdated. But to millions of Jehovah's Witnesses, they carried divine weight. Each phrase he uttered from the stage was treated as a command from heaven. When he spoke, they heard not just a man, but God's representative. His opinions became doctrine, his preferences became rules, his worldview became their reality. That devotion made him powerful, but it also made him dangerous. Under his influence, individuality became rebellion, compassion could be seen as weakness, and silence was often the only form of survival. Creative young people learned to suppress their talents if they didn't serve organizational purposes. Intelligent members learned to dumb down their questions. Empathetic individuals learned to override their conscience when it conflicted with organizational policy. The psychological damage was profound. Many former witnesses describe years of therapy needed to undo the conditioning, to learn that having personal boundaries isn't selfish, that asking questions isn't evil, that feeling joy outside of organizational activities isn't sinful. The fear Morris helped instill didn't disappear when people left. It became part of their mental landscape, requiring conscious effort to overcome. The Watchtower had always demanded loyalty, but in the years of Anthony Morris, obedience became not just an expectation, it became an identity. Being a good witness wasn't about following Christ's example of love and compassion, it was about perfect submission to organizational authority. The transformation was complete. A religion ostensibly about serving God had become a system of serving an institution. Even after his disappearance, Anthony Morris's shadow still lingers over the Watchtower. The culture he helped shape, built on fear, guilt, and blind obedience, didn't vanish with his resignation. It became part of the organization's DNA. His abrupt removal from the governing body in 2023 sent shockwaves through the organization. No official explanation was given. No clear reason provided. The man who had been presented as God's spokesman one day was simply gone the next, with the organization refusing to answer questions. The irony was stunning. Morris, who had demanded absolute transparency from witnesses about their personal lives, who had required members to explain every doubt and question, was himself removed without any accountability to those he'd led. Speculation ran wild. Some believed he'd been caught in serious wrongdoing. Others thought he'd finally gone too far even for the governing body's taste. Still others suspected health issues or internal power struggles. The truth remains hidden behind organizational secrecy, the same secrecy Morris had condemned in others but enjoyed when it protected him. His speeches are still quoted, his tone still echoed in the halls of kingdom halls worldwide. Circuit overseers continue to reference his talks. Elders still use his illustrations in council. The policies he championed remain in force. In many ways, Morris achieved immortality through the system he helped build. His influence persists even in his absence. Many witnesses who lived under his influence still measure their faith through obedience, not conscience. They've internalized his message so completely that they can't imagine an alternative. When they feel doubt, they push it down. When they see injustice, they rationalize it. When they witness harm, they justify it as Jehovah's will. Morris didn't just change policies. He changed how people think. His era may have ended, but his method survived, preserved in policies, publications, and memories of those who once trembled at his words. The organizational structure he helped centralize remains. The financial controls he supported continue. The culture of fear and surveillance he cultivated persists. Yet time has a way of revealing what fear tries to hide. As more former members speak out, a different picture emerges, not of a spiritual shepherd, but of a man who transformed devotion into control. The stories are countless. Families destroyed by shunning policies, young people robbed of education and opportunity, individuals broken by judicial systems that offered judgment without justice. For some, he was a symbol of discipline and conviction. For others, the face of an oppressive system that suffocated individuality. Those who admired him saw strength and unwavering faith. Those who suffered under his influence saw cruelty and abuse of power. Both groups experienced the same man, the same organization, but from vastly different positions. What's undeniable is that his years marked a turning point, when loyalty became law, and compassion was often replaced by command. The Watchtower before Morris was controlling, but it maintained some flexibility, some room for individual conscience. The Watchtower under Morris's influence became rigid, uniform, unforgiving. The question of accountability remains unresolved. Morris shaped the lives of millions, influenced decisions that destroyed families and crushed individuals. Yet he faces no public reckoning, no opportunity for those he hurt to confront him, no mechanism for justice. He simply disappeared, protected by the same organizational structure he helped build. Now the question turns to you, the one watching this right now. Were you inside the Watchtower during Anthony Morris's years? Did you admire him, fear him, or question him in silence? What did his leadership mean to you personally? Perhaps you remember the anxiety before every convention, wondering what new restriction he might announce. Perhaps you recall the relief when he wasn't the scheduled speaker, knowing the talk might be less harsh. Perhaps you lived in constant fear of disappointing him, of disappointing the organization, of disappointing God, unable to separate the three. Or maybe you were one of the believers who found comfort in his certainty, who appreciated his directness, who believed his harshness came from genuine care. Maybe you repeated his warnings to your children, thinking you were protecting them. Maybe you enforced his policies in your congregation, thinking you were serving God. Share your story below. Because understanding what happened under Anthony Morris isn't just about history, it's about healing from it. Every story shared is another piece of the puzzle, another voice breaking the silence, another step toward accountability. For those still inside, questioning in secret, afraid to speak, your doubts are not weakness. Your questions are not apostasy. Your conscience is not rebellion. The fear you feel is real, but it was manufactured by men, not by God. For those who left, carrying wounds that haven't healed, you're not alone. The damage was real, the trauma valid, the loss significant. Healing is possible, but it requires acknowledging what was done, naming it for what it was. And for those watching from outside, trying to understand, this is what high-control religion looks like. Not obvious violence or theatrical cruelty, but systematic psychological manipulation wrapped in religious language. Its families torn apart in the name of purity. Its minds controlled in the name of faith. Its lives constrained in the name of salvation. Anthony Morris's legacy is not the legacy he intended. He may have wanted to be remembered as a faithful servant, a strong leader, a voice of truth. Instead, he'll be remembered as the face of an era when the Watchtower became its worst self, when control overwhelmed compassion, when fear replaced faith, when an organization lost its way in pursuit of absolute power. The Watchtower continues, but the conversation is changing. More voices are speaking. More stories are being told. More people are choosing healing over fear. And that may be the final irony. Morris worked so hard to silence dissent, to crush doubt, to maintain control, but his very extremism may have awakened more people than he ever converted. The era of Anthony Morris is over. The healing from it has just begun.